Steam curled thick in the washroom, rising from the wooden tub in slow, patient breaths. It gathered beneath the low rafters and softened the hard edges of the pine walls until the room felt suspended outside of time. Aurelia Hayes knelt behind Garrett Boone, the warm cloth trembling slightly in her hands as she pressed it to the long plane of his back. He sat bare before the tub, shoulders broad, skin bronzed by sun and labor. Water dripped from the rafters in a steady rhythm. Somewhere beyond the walls the prairie wind passed, but in this room there was only heat, steam, and the fragile nearness of two people who had spent years learning how not to touch. Aurelia drew the cloth down his spine, careful, deliberate. Her body knew discipline. It had been trained into her bones. Every movement she made was measured, controlled, as though the smallest misstep might shatter something she could not afford to lose. Yet her hands betrayed her. They shook faintly with each pass. Garrett's breath left him in a slow exhale. He had not meant for this moment to feel so heavy. He had asked simply because the habit lingered from boyhood. Warm water, someone else's care. But now, with her kneeling behind him, the closeness pressed in on him until it was almost unbearable. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of years of restraint, of a marriage begun in obligation, of nights spent apart with a wall between them thicker than timber. The steam seemed to hold all of it, every unsaid word suspended in the air. Aurelia's thoughts drifted despite herself. She had been shaped by command and consequence, by a father who believed affection was weakness and obedience the highest virtue. Her body had learned endurance long before it learned tenderness. Even now, kneeling in the steam, she fought the instinct to retreat inward, to harden. Garrett shifted slightly, muscles tightening beneath her touch. "I never knew," he said quietly, breaking the hush, "that closeness could feel like this." Her hand paused. "Not the kind you take," he went on, voice low, roughened by heat and something deeper. "The kind that's given." Aurelia swallowed. The cloth rested against his skin, forgotten. She had been given very little in her life without price attached. Kindness always came with a ledger. Care was something earned through perfection. And yet here he was, speaking as though what she offered mattered. Garrett reached back then, not abrupt, not rough, but with a hesitance that surprised them both. His fingers closed around her wrist, grounding her, anchoring the moment. Aurelia stiffened at once, breath catching as old instincts surged, warning, caution, self-command. He turned his head just enough for her to see his face through the veil of steam. There was no demand there, no expectation written into his eyes, only fear. Fear and hope and a vulnerability she had never seen on him before. "Aurelia," he whispered. Her name sounded different in his mouth, careful, reverent. "I don't want a future that belongs to our fathers. I don't want a life measured in contracts and silence." Her heart hammered, loud enough she was sure he could hear it. "I want something that's ours, something no one can take or trade away." The words settled over her like heat. She searched his face, reading it the way she had learned to read markets and men, looking for leverage, for deceit, for the hidden cost. She found none. "I want you," Garrett continued, voice trembling now, stripped of the careless ease he had worn for so long. "And tonight, I want you to bear my child." The sentence landed not as command, but as a confession. Aurelia stared at him, steam blurring the room until there was only his face and the sound of her own breath. For years she had been spoken of as property, as utility, as a means to secure alliances and names. Even her body had been treated as something owed. This was different. This was a question, however clumsily asked, a reaching, uncertain, human plea. Her wrist was still in his grasp, warm, steady. He did not tighten his hold. He did not pull her closer. He waited. Choice stood before her, stark and terrifying. If she stepped back now, she could return to the safety of distance, to the quiet endurance she knew so well. But if she stayed, if she answered, there would be no retreat, only a path forward, uncharted and irrevocable. Aurelia drew a slow breath. Her voice, when it came, shook, but it did not break. "If you truly mean that," she said softly, "then I want it too." Something in Garrett's face gave way. Relief, wonder, disbelief all at once. He rose from the tub, water sloshing quietly, and turned to her fully. Steam wrapped around them, shielding the moment from the world. He drew her into him, not in haste, not in hunger, but with care, as though she might vanish. Their foreheads touched, breath mingled. The room seemed to hold its breath with them. No rush, no force, only two people standing at the edge of a life they would choose, together. Outside the washroom, the prairie wind moved on, unaware. Inside, something irrevocable had begun, and in the thick curl of steam, Aurelia Hayes and Garrett Boone crossed from duty into decision, from silence into truth, one whispered promise at a time.
The kitchen was warm with firelight and quiet industry. Aurelia stood at the stove, stirring a pot of broth that had been simmering since afternoon. The scent of onions and herbs filled the small room, clinging to the beams and the curtains like a promise. She moved with practiced ease, measured, efficient, her body knowing this space as well as it knew restraint. Behind her, the door creaked softly. Garrett stepped inside, shoulders dusted with sawdust, shirt damp with sweat from the day's work. He paused just inside the threshold, watching her without announcing himself. For months he had lived beside her as though they were occupants of separate worlds, careful not to intrude, careful not to ask. Now he found himself unwilling to stay apart. He crossed the room quietly, too quietly. Aurelia sensed him only when his warmth brushed her back, a subtle shift in the air that made her spine stiffen. She did not turn. Her grip tightened on the spoon. "You're home," she said evenly. He replied, voice low. "Smells good." She nodded, stirring once more to keep her hands busy. Praise unsettled her more than criticism ever had. Praise asked for something in return, acknowledgement, softness, response. Garrett lingered behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath near her shoulder. Not touching, just there. "I want to taste it," he said, lightly, as though the words were nothing more than idle conversation. Aurelia reached for a spoon and dipped it into the pot. "Then wait," she said, holding it up without turning. "It's hot." He did not take it. Instead, he shook his head slowly. "Not from there." Her hand stilled mid-air. The room seemed to tighten, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud. She lowered the spoon, setting it carefully on the counter, as though any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "Garrett," she began, warning edging into her voice. Garrett stepped closer, gently turning her by the waist until she faced him. His hands were warm, firm, but hesitant, as though he would release her at the slightest resistance. "I'm not jesting," he said. Gone was the easy grin, the careless tone he had once worn like armor. His blue eyes searched her face, steady and open. "I want to know you, not the woman who keeps the house running. You." Aurelia's breath caught. Her whole life had been built around being useful, being composed, being unassailable. No one had ever asked her for more than function.
She should have stepped back, should have reminded him of boundaries, of propriety, of the distance that had kept her safe. Instead, she stood rooted to the floor. Garrett leaned in slowly, giving her time to refuse, time to retreat. She did neither. Their lips met in a tentative brush, uncertain, almost fragile. Aurelia stiffened at first, her body bracing out of habit. But Garrett did not press. He waited, breath mingling with hers, allowing the moment to unfold at her pace. Something in her loosened. The kiss deepened, warmth blooming where restraint had long ruled. The world narrowed to the feel of his mouth, the steady reassurance of his hands at her waist. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt before she realized she had moved. The spoon slipped from the counter and clattered softly to the floor. When they parted, Aurelia's breath came uneven, her cheeks flushed with heat and disbelief. She stared at him, eyes wide, as though she had crossed some invisible threshold and could not yet see where it led. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "You see?" he murmured. "That's the truth." She turned away, overwhelmed, pressing her palms to the counter as if to steady herself. "Don't be foolish," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. He did not laugh. He did not tease. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space. That, more than anything, unsettled her. He was not claiming victory. He was not demanding more. He was choosing restraint for her. Aurelia's chest tightened. She had spent her life armored against force, against command. She had never learned how to defend herself against gentleness. That night, the meal passed in quiet, but it was no longer the brittle silence of strangers. It was weighted with awareness, each glance charged, each small movement noticed. Later, when she carried a basin of warm water to the washroom and set it outside the door as she had done countless times before, she hesitated. The act felt different now, less duty, more offering. Garrett emerged, sleeves rolled, pausing when he saw her still standing there. "Thank you," he said, softly. The words struck deeper than he could know. She nodded once, then turned away before he could see how they affected her. That night, as Aurelia lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart still racing. The house no longer felt like a shared space divided by walls. It felt unsettled, awake. In his room, Garrett lay equally still, replaying the moment again and again, not the kiss itself, but the way she had stayed, the way she had not pulled away. Between them, something fragile and powerful had been set into motion. The house, which had once echoed with nothing but obligation, now held a quiet promise, unspoken but impossible to ignore. And neither of them slept easily, knowing that what had begun with a single careful kiss could no longer be undone.
The sky over Willow Bend had turned the color of dull iron by the time the carriage arrived. Garrett was splitting logs in the yard when he heard the wheels grinding against the dirt road, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. He straightened at once, the axe stilled mid-air. Only one man traveled with that kind of weight behind him. Only one man announced his presence without ever raising his voice. His father. The carriage rolled to a stop before the cabin, dust lifting and settling around the polished wheels. The driver leapt down quickly, opening the door. Mr. Boone stepped out, boots immaculate, coat unwrinkled, his posture rigid as law itself. He did not look at Garrett. He did not need to. Garrett wiped his hands on his trousers and followed him inside. Aurelia heard the door open and felt it before she saw it, the tightening in the air, the old familiar pressure that had once ruled her father's house. She emerged from the kitchen and stopped short at the sight of the tall man already standing at the table, a leather case open before him.
papers lay spread with ruthless precision. Mr. Boone did not greet her. He barely acknowledged her presence at all. His gaze remained fixed on his son as he spoke. 6 months, he said flatly. That is more than enough time. Garrett said nothing. His jaw tightened. No child, his father continued, tapping a finger against the topmost document. No sign, no assurance. The Boone name does not wait on uncertainty. Aurelia's fingers curled into her skirt. Each word landed like a hammer, striking against wounds she had spent her life concealing. She kept her face calm, chin lifted, refusing to offer him the satisfaction of visible hurt. I have prepared alternatives, Mr. Boone went on, sliding the papers forward. Families of standing, girls young, strong, proven stock. If this union cannot fulfill its purpose, I will correct the mistake. The mistake. Aurelia's breath came shallow, but she did not speak. She knew this tone too well, the tone of men who believed decisions were cleaner when made without women's voices complicating them. Garrett's silence stretched. Mr. Boone mistook it for submission. I warned you from the beginning. Marriage is duty. A Boone man produces an heir. If you cannot— His eyes flicked briefly toward Aurelia, sharp and assessing. Then another will. The words cut deeper than she expected. For a heartbeat, doubt surged. Old fear whispered that this too would be taken from her, that she would be cast aside, measured and found wanting. Then Garrett moved. He lifted his head slowly, deliberately, as though each motion required decision. When he spoke, his voice was firm enough to still the room. You don't need to find another. His father paused. She is with child. The words rang out, clear and unwavering. Aurelia's head snapped up, her heart slamming against her ribs. For a fraction of a second, the room tilted, reality slipping its bounds. Mr. Boone stared at his son. What did you say? Garrett stepped forward, placing himself just slightly between his father and Aurelia, not shielding her, but standing with her. My wife is carrying my child. She will give the Boone name and heir. You need not interfere further. Silence crashed down, heavy and absolute. Mr. Boone's gaze shifted slowly to Aurelia, probing, searching for weakness, for contradiction. Years of discipline rose up within her. She straightened, lifting her chin, meeting his stare without flinching. She did not deny it. That was all the confirmation he needed. At last, Mr. Boone exhaled. It was not relief, but recalibration. He gathered the papers one by one, movement slower now, more deliberate. If that is so, then I will wait, but do not mistake patience for forgiveness. The Boone name endures, failure does not. He closed the case with a sharp snap and turned toward the door. Do not fail me, Garrett. The door shut behind him. The carriage wheels resumed their grinding, fading into the distance. The cabin felt suddenly too quiet. Aurelia stood frozen, the echo of Garrett's words still ringing in her ears. She turned to him slowly, her expression a mixture of shock, reproach, and something dangerously close to awe. Why would you say that? She asked, voice low but urgent. If he finds out it isn't true. Garrett faced her fully now. Gone was the boy who had once ducked beneath his father's shadow. In his place stood a man flushed with resolve. It was the only way to stop him, he said simply, and because I meant every part of it. Her breath caught. You've left me no way back, she whispered. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Then don't go back, he said. Let's move forward, not for him, for us. Aurelia searched his face, weighing fear against truth. She saw it then, the certainty, the choice. He had claimed her not out of obligation, but defiance, out of love. Something shifted deep within her. She nodded once. The lie, spoken in fire and necessity, had taken its first breath, and neither of them yet knew that it would soon become the truest thing they had ever spoken. The truth came to Aurelia quietly, not in a sudden pain or a dramatic moment, but in the stillness of an early morning when the cabin had not yet woken. Pale light slipped through the narrow window, dust motes floating lazily in the air. The fire had burned down to embers, and the house breathed in the gentle rhythm of rest. Aurelia stood alone near the hearth, one hand braced against the table, the other pressed flat to her stomach. She had felt it for days now, the strange heaviness, the faint waves of nausea that rose with the dawn, the exhaustion that settled into her bones no matter how early she slept. At first she had dismissed it as strain, as worry, as the lingering weight of winter. She had lived her life trained to ignore her body's complaints. But this morning, certainty settled over her like a hand at her back. She closed her eyes. The lie Garrett had spoken to protect her, to shield their fragile beginning from his father's reach, had taken root. Fear followed immediately, sharp and familiar. She thought of her own childhood, of rules carved into her spine, of affection rationed and conditional. She feared she would fail this new life growing within her, feared she did not know how to be gentle, how to nurture without calculation. Then came joy, not loud, not wild, but deep, a warmth that spread through her chest, steady and grounding. This child was not demanded of her. It was not a contract fulfilled. It was born of choice, of a night where she had not been commanded, but asked. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. By dusk, Garrett returned from the ranch, shoulders slumped with fatigue, dust clinging to his trousers. He pushed open the door, already shaping her name on his lips, but stopped short when he saw her standing by the hearth. She was very still. "Aurelia?" he asked. Something in her posture set him on edge. "What is it?" She turned toward him. Her dark eyes shone, uncertain yet bright, as though holding something too large to be contained. She took a breath. "I'm truly with child," she said. For a moment Garrett did not move. The words seemed to pass through him slowly, as though his mind could not yet catch them. Then understanding struck across his face, pure, unguarded, astonished. He laughed, a raw, boyish sound that echoed off the walls. "Truly?" he asked, crossing the room in 2 long strides. "Aurelia, are you certain?" She nodded, tears blurring her vision. "I am." He gathered her into his arms, lifting her clear off the floor in a rush of joy. She gasped, half laughing, half scolding. "Garrett, put me down, I'm dizzy." He set her down at once, hands lingering at her waist as if afraid she might vanish. His eyes searched her face, reverent now. "Our child," he said softly. "We made something real." From that day on, the cabin changed, not in shape but in spirit. Garrett woke before dawn, restless with purpose. He split wood, mended fencing, counted stores with new care. Where once he had drifted through days, he now measured them, planning for seasons yet to come. He built a cradle of pine in the evenings, boards rough at first, joints clumsy. Aurelia watched from the doorway, heart full as he sanded and reshaped, refusing to stop until it was smooth enough for a newborn's skin. Each stroke of his hand carried devotion. She, in turn, stitched a small blanket from scraps of cloth, her fingers gentler than they had ever been when bent over ledgers. Sometimes she pressed the fabric to her cheek, imagining the warmth of the child who would one day sleep wrapped inside it. At night, Garrett sat beside her by the fire, ear pressed to her belly, as if listening for secrets. "What's it saying?" he asked, eyes bright. "Too soon," she laughed softly.
"Never too soon to hear your child," he replied with solemn certainty. Joy threaded through their days, but fear did not vanish entirely. One afternoon, Aurelia wept alone in the kitchen, haunted by thoughts of her father and of Garrett's, men who believed bloodlines mattered more than hearts. Garrett found her there, tears streaking her cheeks. He drew her close, his voice firm. "They can chain our past, but not our child's future. This life will grow in love, not bargains." She pressed her face to his chest, letting his steadiness anchor her. When the cradle was finished, they placed it beside their bed. Aurelia spread the blanket across it, smoothing the folds with trembling hands. They stood together in silence until Garrett slipped an arm around her waist. "This house is more than ours now," he murmured. "It's a home." That night, he laid her hand over her belly, his own covering hers. 3 heartbeats seemed to echo in the quiet room, hers, his, and the fragile rhythm of a future newly born. The lie spoken in defiance had become truth, and with it a life neither of them had dared to imagine began to take shape.
The night came heavy with rain and wind, as though the prairie itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Inside the small cabin at the edge of Willow Bend, lamplight flickered against pine walls darkened by years of smoke and seasons of endurance. Aurelia lay on the bed, her body bent beneath waves of pain that rose and fell with relentless purpose. Each contraction stole her breath, pressed a sharp cry against her teeth, but she did not scream. She had been taught all her life how to endure. Garrett knelt beside her, clutching her hand in both of his knuckles white, his face slick with sweat and tears alike. He had never felt so helpless, or so fiercely alive. "I'm here," he kept saying, voice breaking, yet stubborn. "I'm not leaving. You're not alone. You're strong, Aurelia, stronger than anyone I know." The doctor moved with quiet efficiency, issuing calm instructions that cut through the chaos. The room filled with sound, the crackle of firewood, the wind battering the shutters, Aurelia's labored breaths, Garrett's whispered pleas. Pain crested, sharper than before, and Aurelia cried out, crushing Garrett's hand. He did not flinch. He leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers, letting her feel his presence anchoring her to the world. "Stay with me," he whispered desperately. "Please, we need you." Through the haze of pain, Aurelia found his eyes. In them she saw no fear of failure, no calculation, only trust. She gathered what strength remained and pushed with everything she had left. Then came the cry, clear, strong, alive. The sound cut through the storm like lightning. Garrett's breath left him in a sob as the doctor lifted the child into the light. "A healthy boy," he said, "strong lungs." Garrett reached out with shaking arms and took his son, cradling the tiny, writhing body against his chest. The weight of him, so small yet immeasurable, broke something open inside Garrett that could never be closed again. "Our son," he whispered, tears streaming freely now. "Aurelia, he's here!" When he laid the baby into her arms, Aurelia's exhaustion gave way to wonder. She gazed down at the small face, the tiny fists, the warm, living proof of everything they had chosen. A faint smile curved her lips, fragile, victorious. "He's real," she whispered. "We did this." Garrett bent and kissed her damp brow, his tears falling into her hair. "You gave me everything," he said hoarsely. Later, when the storm had softened and the baby slept in the cradle Garrett had carved with his own hands, Aurelia sat upright by the stove. In her lap lay a thin stack of yellowed papers, creased, worn, heavy with memory. The marriage contract, the document that once bound her life to duty, silence, and expectation. Garrett stood nearby, holding their son, watching her quietly. "Are you sure?" he asked gently.
Aurelia nodded. Her eyes were steady, resolute. "We don't need this anymore." She struck a match. The flame flared bright, catching the edge of the paper. Ink curled and blackened. Names vanished. Clauses turned to ash. The past burned away line by line. When the last page crumbled, Aurelia opened the stove door and let the ashes scatter, carried off by the heat and the wind beyond the cracks in the walls. "No paper decides our lives now, only us," she said softly. Garrett stepped close, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, their son nestled between them. He pressed his cheek to hers. Forever home. The days that followed were quieter, but fuller. Garrett rose early, splitting wood and tending fences, returning often just to check on Aurelia and the baby. He learned the awkward art of rocking, of humming tunes he barely remembered, of holding something fragile with reverence instead of fear. Aurelia watched him from the bed, then from the porch, finally standing beside him, strength returning slowly. She saw the man he had become, not because he was forced, but because he had chosen to be. One morning she stepped onto the porch with their son cradled against her chest. Garrett was chopping wood, the rhythm steady, purposeful. The baby stirred, tiny fists waving as if reaching towards his father. "Look," she whispered to the child, "that's your father, the man who chose us." Garrett looked up, met her gaze, and smiled, a full, unguarded smile that carried no shadow of the boy he once was. As seasons turned, the town watched. Whispers shifted. Pity gave way to respect. No one spoke of contracts anymore. They spoke of the way Garrett worked, the way Aurelia walked with her head high, the way their child laughed in the sunlight. One winter night, wind howling across the prairie, the baby cried. Aurelia stirred, but Garrett was already there, lifting him gently, humming softly in the dim glow of the lamp. Aurelia watched, tears shining. The man who once felt distant now stood steady, tender, unafraid. When Garrett returned to bed and placed the sleeping child between them, he reached for her hand. "I'll never leave you alone again," he said. She rested her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but certain. "I know." Outside, the prairie wind carried its endless song. Inside, the small cabin at the edge of Willow Bend, 3 hearts beat in harmony. The lie that once was spoken in defiance had become truth, and from it, a family, chosen, unbroken, and free, had taken root at last.